Title: At the altar, Groom betrayed his bride. She returned with ultimate revenge. What she revealed next made him regret everything. Opening hook action. First, the grand wedding hall in Enugu fell deathly silent. Ifeoma, 28 years old and 5 months pregnant, stood at the altar in her shimmering white lace gown. The fabric caught the light from hundreds of overhead bulbs, throwing tiny sparks of gold across the vaulted ceiling. She had dreamed of this moment since she was a little girl, folding her mother's kitchen cloth into a makeshift veil and marching across the compound with the gravity of a child who takes joy seriously. Now here she was surrounded by 300 guests, every chair filled, every eye locked on her. Mothers pressed their palms together. Old men leaned forward on carved walking sticks. Children peered between the gaps in adult shoulders, not fully understanding the ceremony but understanding, in the way children always do, that something enormous was happening in this room. Emeka stood opposite her in his crisp agbada, white and gold, hand embroidered along the neckline by a tailor in Onitsha who had spent a week on the detail alone. He smiled. Not the nervous smile of a groom overcome by the moment, but the settled, satisfied smile of a man who believes the outcome of a game has already been determined in his favor. He had no idea. She took the microphone with steady hands. Family, friends, her voice rang clear and calm through the hall speakers. No tremor, no hesitation. Thank you for coming to celebrate what I once thought was love. Emeka's smile froze. Something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker. Not quite panic, yet more like the first cold understanding that the story was no longer his to tell. Last night, I discovered that Emeka and my own cousin Adaora have been sleeping together for months. She paused deliberately, letting those words travel the full length of the hall and find every ear. They plan to collect my father's money after the wedding and then abandon me and our baby. Gasps exploded across the room in a wave. Aunties grabbed each other's arms. Uncles rose from their seats. The flower girls on the side benches turned to each other with wide, bewildered eyes. Someone in the back dropped a wedding program and nobody bent to pick it up. Before Emeka could open his mouth, Ifeoma connected her phone to the hall's sound system with the cable that had been quietly positioned earlier. A crackle of static. Then Emeka's own voice, unmistakable, unhurried, lazy with cruelty, filled every corner of the room and bounced off every wall. She's too soft to ever suspect anything. And this child was a mistake anyway. The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that hall had ever heard. Adaora rose from her seat near the back of the hall. She stood too quickly, knocking her chair backward, and moved toward the exit with the stiff, rapid walk of someone who has calculated that speed is her only option. A wall of aunties stepped into her path before she had taken 4 steps, arms folded, faces set. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Emeka stammered. He opened his mouth twice. Words failed him for the first time in his life. This man who had charmed his way through 3 years of careful deception, who had always known what to say and exactly when to say it, standing with his mouth open in front of 300 people and producing nothing. Ifeoma looked him dead in the eyes. You betrayed me at the altar of lies. Her chin lifted. Today I return the favor with the truth. She handed the microphone back to the pastor's assistant with both hands, turned, and walked back down the aisle like a queen. Head high, spine straight, one hand resting gently on her belly, the other swinging free at her side. She left total destruction behind her, and she did not look back at any of it. Hello, wonderful family, welcome back to Stories That Heal. If this powerful story of betrayal, courage, and sweet justice has already stopped your breath, then smash that like button right now. Share this video with every woman in your life who needs to be reminded that her dignity is worth more than any ring, any title, any man who was never worthy of her. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a single story. Drop a comment below and tell me, are you ready? Because now we are going all the way back to the very beginning, and I promise you, by the time we are done, you will understand exactly why this woman is a legend. Let us go. Scene 1: The dream wedding preparations in the bustling city of Enugu. Under the warm amber light of a late afternoon sun just 3 days before the wedding, Ifeoma Okafor stood in front of the full-length mirror in her mother's sitting room and felt, for one perfect moment, that everything was exactly as it should be. The white lace gown had been a project of love. Auntie Ngozi, her mother's younger sister, the one with the sharpest eye for fabric and the longest patience for detail, had sewn it herself over 3 full weeks. She had measured Ifeoma 8 separate times, accommodating the gentle arc of the pregnancy with adjustments so subtle and skilled that the final result looked not like a compromise but like an intention. The lace was imported guipure, ivory white with a faint shimmer woven into the thread, and it caught light the way fresh water does, always moving, always alive. Foma pressed her palm flat against her stomach, felt the warmth. The baby was quiet today, folded inward and still, as though even this small, unborn person understood that rest was required before something large arrived. Today is the beginning of everything, Ifeoma whispered to her own reflection. Her mother, Mama Nnena, appeared in the doorway a moment later, hands still dusted with the pepper she had been grinding in the kitchen, a wrapper tied high on her chest the way she always wore it when she cooked. She stopped when she saw her daughter standing there in the completed gown under the room's warm light, and her face changed entirely. All the cooking, all the organizing, all the weeks of logistics dissolved in a single second of pure maternal feeling. Kai Mo, she breathed. My God. You look like the answer to every prayer I ever prayed for you. Ifeoma laughed softly, the easy laugh of a woman at peace, and turned to face her mother. They stood looking at each other across the small sitting room with its family photographs and crocheted chair backs, and the framed scripture above the television that had been there since Ifeoma was a child. 2 women, one at the closing of a long chapter of sacrifice and work, the other standing at the threshold of what she believed, completely and without reservation, was her beginning. Outside, the compound rang with controlled, joyful chaos. Auntie Ngozi had transferred her considerable organizational energy from the gown to the canopies and was directing 3 young men with the authority of a military officer. The caterers had arrived with enormous pots jollof rice cooked over firewood, egusi soup thick with stockfish and ada, pepper soup for the uncles who would ask for it before the evening was done. The smoky, peppery, deeply familiar aroma moved through every room of the house and settled into the curtains and the cushions, the way the smell of a celebration does when it is genuine. The soebai, rich green and gold, the Akafor family colors chosen by Mama Nnena after 3 weeks of deliberation, and 2 trips to the fabric market had been collected and distributed among the women 2 weeks earlier, and they were already arriving in their matching outfits, laughing and adjusting each other's jewel and taking photographs at the compound gate. Emeka had promised Ifeoma the wedding of her dreams, and he had, by every visible measure, delivered. A grand hall in the GRA booked 8 months in advance, a live band from Lagos whose trumpet player had performed at 2 government functions, 4 different flavors of cake arranged on a tiered display platform, a video crew with professional cameras, and a drone that would capture the moment she walked out of the house from above. Everything was in place. Everything was perfect. She had no reason, standing in that sitting room in that shimmering gown with her mother's eyes full of joy, to feel anything other than happiness. So she felt happiness. She held it close. She did not know it was the last uncontaminated happiness she would feel for some time. Slow digital zoom on the wedding gown fabric catching the light, then close-up on her hand resting on her belly, then a slow, wide pan through the window to the decorated compound outside, where women in green and gold move between canopies, seen too the last night of innocence, the night before the wedding. Ifeoma could not sleep. She had told herself it was normal. Every bride lay awake the night before. There was too much to hold in a sleeping mind, the logistics of the morning. The faces of 300 guests, the vows she had spent a week composing and then simplified to 12 words because the simplest things were the most true. But there was also something else. Something she had been carrying for weeks, not a thought, exactly, more like a low sound at the edge of hearing that she could never quite identify. A discomfort she had chosen, again and again, not to examine. She got up at 8:30. The compound was finally quiet. The aunties had dispersed to the guest houses. The caterers were coming back in the morning. The generator had been switched off. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and thought about the wristwatch. She had ordered it weeks earlier, found the engraver in Agui through a friend's recommendation, a quiet craftsman who worked from a small shop near the market and who had a reputation for work that lasted. The watch was solid and masculine, with a brown leather strap and a face that reminded her of something her father might wear. She had chosen the inscription herself, changing it 4 times before settling on the final version, engraved on the back in clean, small letters. "My heart chose you. Always. Ife." It had arrived that afternoon in a velvet box. She had spent 20 minutes just sitting with it in her lap, turning it over, reading the inscription again and again, feeling the particular tenderness of a woman who still believes completely in the person she loves. She decided to take it to him that night. She wanted him to go to sleep with it on his wrist. She wanted the first morning of their married life to begin with him already wearing her words. At 9:30, with the compound quiet and dark around her, Ifeoma wrapped the velvet box in gold tissue paper, clipped it closed with a small satin bow, climbed into her car, and drove through the quiet Enugu night toward Emeka's apartment on Zik Avenue. The streets had emptied of their daytime noise. A few boda riders passed under streetlights. Somewhere behind a fence, a dog made a brief, half-hearted sound. She drove with her window halfway down, letting the cool harmattan air move across her face, carrying the smell of dry harmattan dust and night-blooming things, and she felt a steady, low happiness that she would later remember as the last uncomplicated feeling of that chapter of her life. She parked outside the compound gate and climbed out carefully. The belly required a little extra consideration, getting in and out of low seats now. The security man at the front was dozing in his plastic chair, chin on his chest, his torch loose in his hand. She had done this before. She slipped through the side entrance, smiling at the familiar path, at the small garden of croton plants someone had planted along the fence, at the light she could see in Emeka's sitting room window. She was almost at the front door when she heard it, laughter. She stopped walking. A woman's laughter, drifting from the partially open bedroom window. Familiar in a way that reached all the way back into childhood. Lazy and intimate and entirely at home. She knew that laugh the way she knew her own name. She had grown up inside the sound of it. She had shared school lunches alongside it for 12 years. She had whispered secrets across garden fences on Sunday afternoons in voices kept low, so the adults in the houses behind them would not hear. She had danced next to it at cousins' weddings and wept alongside it at family funerals and trusted it the way you only trust the things that have always simply been there. It was Adaora, her cousin, her blood. Ifeoma did not move for 5 full seconds. Her mind was doing the particular terrible work of a mind that knows the truth before it is willing to say it clearly. Then something steadier than emotion took over, an animal instinct for evidence, for certainty, for seeing the thing completely before deciding what to do with it. She moved quietly. She moved until she could see through the gap in the curtain. And then she saw everything. Extreme close-up on the velvet box in her hands, then slow pull back as her footsteps slow, then close-up on her face as her expression shifts from anticipation to understanding, then cut to black. Scene 3, the heart-shattering moment. The bedroom lamp was on a single warm-toned side light that threw its glow across the bed and the 2 people on it in a way that made everything visible and unmistakable. There was no ambiguity, no possible explanation that would rearrange what she was seeing into something bearable. Emeka, Adaora, together. Ifeoma stood completely still. The velvet box was still in her hands, wrapped in its gold tissue, the satin bow still neatly tied. The baby was quiet. The night was quiet, and the world she had built in her mind over 3 years, every promise, every introduction to family, every Sunday church visit, every conversation about the future kitchen and the children's names and which neighborhood they would choose to live in, all of it was silently, comprehensively dismantling itself inside her. Then Adaora spoke. She spoke in the lazy, satisfied way of someone who feels completely safe. After the wedding, she said, tracing a slow finger along Emeka's arm, we collect the bride price money and whatever the father transfers for the business, and we run to Abuja. Give it 3 months. By November he can announce the marriage has broken down irreconcilably. She paused. She will be devastated, but she will not fight. She is not the fighting type. Emeka chuckled. The sound was warm and unhurried and deeply familiar to Ifeoma. It was the same chuckle he gave when something pleased him. She had loved that sound. She had collected it. She had thought more than once that it was one of her favorite sounds in the world. She thinks this pregnancy will tie me down, he said, reaching for the glass of water on the bedside table. She thinks a baby is a lock. He shook his head with a small smile. I only proposed because of the transport company. The father promised me the general manager position after the wedding. Once that is in writing and the money is transferred, he made a gesture with his hand, casual, dismissive, the gesture of a man discarding something of no particular value. She is too soft to ever see it coming. And this child, he paused. This child was a mistake anyway. 4 words, was a mistake anyway. Ifeoma's hand moved to her belly without her deciding to move it. She felt the roundness, the warmth, the particular solidity of the life inside her. The life that the man in that room had just described, in his own comfortable voice, as a mistake. She stood there for 6 more seconds, 6 seconds during which she felt every single layer of the betrayal land on her one by one, like stones placed carefully on a chest. Then she turned and walked back to her car. She did not run. She did not call out. She moved with the controlled quiet of someone who has understood that the next decision she makes will determine the shape of everything that follows. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her hands rested in her lap. The velvet box sat on the passenger seat, still wrapped in gold tissue, the satin bow still neatly tied. Through the windscreen, the night looked exactly as it had when she arrived, the same empty street, the same dozing security guard, the same small croton garden along the fence. Then the baby kicked, one deliberate, unmistakable kick. As though the small person inside her had heard something through the walls of the world they lived in and wanted to register their presence. I am here. We are here. We are real. Something happened inside Ifeoma in that moment, a settling, like water finding its level after it has been disturbed. Not peace exactly, not yet, but clarity. The particular, steely clarity of a woman who has been given the worst possible news and discovered, to her own surprise, that she is not destroyed by it. She was not going to cry in a hospital car park. She was not going to call her mother at 10 o'clock at night and blow the family apart before morning. She was not going to confront Emeka privately in a room where he could be calm and precise and surgical and talk until she doubted what her own ears had recorded. He had chosen a stage without knowing it. He had been comfortable enough to perform his cruelty loudly, in a lit room with a window open. She would give him a stage too. A much larger one. Extreme close-up on Ifeoma's hands in her lap, then slow zoom on the gold-wrapped velvet box on the passenger seat, then slow focus on her eyes in the rearview mirror. Steady, clear, resolute. Now, let the full story unfold in 5 powerful chapters. Chapter 1, the perfect illusion. Ifeoma Okafor had always been the one people pointed to. Not the loudest cousin at family gatherings, that was Adaora. Always at the center, always performing, always needing the room's attention like a plant needing sunlight. Not the most academically decorated. Her older brother Chidi had taken that distinction with his engineering degree and his government scholarship. Ifeoma had been something different. She was the one people pointed to when they wanted to demonstrate what consistency looked like, what integrity looked like, what a woman who knew herself looked like, without drama or proclamation, simply by living in a particular way, year after year. She had been born into the Okafor household on a Thursday morning at the tail end of the Harmattan season, and from the beginning she was, as Mama Nnenna always said, a settled child. Not passive. There was a quiet will in her that anyone who crossed it discovered quickly and did not forget. But settled, comfortable inside her own skin in the particular way that comes not from absence of difficulty, but from having a deeply rooted sense of who one is. She grew up in a household where honesty was not a value that was discussed, it was simply practiced, every day without ceremony, the way breathing is practiced. Chief Okafor, her father, was a man who had built his transport company from a single aging Danfo bus purchased on credit from a cousin in 1989 to a registered fleet of 18 vehicles by the time Ifeoma was in secondary school. He had done it without shortcuts, without corners cut, without the particular compromises that men in competitive industries sometimes convince themselves are unavoidable. He was known in Enugu as a man whose word meant exactly what it said, and that reputation had cost him short-term convenience many times and delivered him long-term respect every time. Ifeoma was his daughter in the deepest sense. She studied early childhood education at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka and returned to Enugu after graduation without any particular drama or ambition for the spectacular. She wanted to teach small children. She wanted to be near her parents. She wanted to build something real at a pace she could sustain. She found a position at a nursery school, a short walk from the family compound, and she settled into it with the contentment of someone who has found the right fit. She loved the work profoundly, the noise and physical chaos of small people discovering that the world has rules and testing all of them constantly, the drawings pinned in overlapping rows along every wall, the afternoon prayer time when tiny voices wrapped around difficult words with an earnestness that never failed to move her. When Emeka arrived in her life 3 years ago, he did not arrive loudly. That was the first thing that lowered her guard, she would later think. He was not the kind of man who burst into rooms and demanded to be registered. He arrived at the Edge's A friend's birthday party, a mutual relative's introduction, a second meeting that seemed accidental but was not. He took his time. He read her. He understood, with the particular intelligence of a man who has studied what women respond to, that Ifeoma was not moved by flash or performance. She was moved by attention, by consistency, by the sense that she was being truly seen rather than merely pursued. And so he gave her those things, deliberately, skillfully. He remembered small things she mentioned in passing: her favorite pepper soup spot on Independence Layout, the name of the teacher who had believed in her in secondary school, the color she had always wanted to paint a future kitchen wall. He called when he said he would. He arrived when he said he would arrive. He met her parents at the 3-month mark, sat with Chief Okafor and spoke about business and vision and responsibility with the measured confidence of a man who has things under control, and the chief, who was not easily impressed and was usually the last person to soften toward a suitor, had looked across the sitting room at his daughter afterward and nodded once. That nod was everything. Emeka came to church. He called Mama Nnenna on Sundays. He deferred to Chief Okafor's opinions on business matters in the particular respectful way that Igbo sons-in-law are expected to defer, without servility, with the warmth of a man who genuinely values the elder's experience. He was, by every visible and audible measure, an answer to prayer. The compound had hummed with wedding preparations for 6 months. The Asoebi in green and gold had been designed, priced, and distributed. The hall had been booked and toured and approved. Mama Nnenna had attended 3 fittings for her own Geo. Chief Okafor had spoken privately with Emeka about the managerial position in the transport company, a significant role, with real income and real responsibility, the kind of opportunity a father offers only to a man he trusts entirely with his daughter's future. Ifeoma had noticed things. She had. She was not, even in the deepest layer of love, a woman without instinct. She noticed late nights with explanations that were smooth but thin, a sharpness in his tone on certain evenings that was apologized for too quickly, as though the apology had been prepared in advance, a perfume once on a collar that she could not place. Small things. She had taken each one and folded it carefully away in the part of herself that chose faith over suspicion, that chose to believe the man she had watched closely for 3 years was who he had consistently appeared to be. Love, she told herself, required trust. Marriage, her mother had told her, required patience. She was preparing to be patient for the rest of her life. The velvet box sat in her wardrobe for 2 days before she decided to take it to him that night. That decision, that small, loving, completely innocent decision, changed everything. Slow zoom across old family photographs on the sitting room wall, then close-up on Chief Akafer's face in one photo, dignified. Solid, then slow pan to the engraved wristwatch in its velvet box, then to the quiet street outside at night. Chapter 2. The night of silent tears. Sleep refused to come. Not even close. Foma sat in her car for 14 minutes after she drove away from Emeka's compound. She sat without moving, without crying, without calling anyone. Just sitting with the knowledge, the full, clear, inescapable knowledge, and letting it settle into her completely, the way a liquid settles into a vessel and takes the vessel's exact shape. She wanted to understand the true dimensions of what she was dealing with before she decided what to do with it. When she finally drove home and sat on the edge of her bed in her childhood room, the crying came. But it was not the wild, performative grief of shock. It was something quieter and more thorough than that. She cried for the 3 years. For every Sunday morning, every phone call, every meal eaten together, every conversation about the future that she now had to reinterpret through the lens of deliberate deception. She cried for her father, who had opened his business to this man, who had made a promise based on trust, who would feel the weaponization of his own generosity when the truth emerged. She cried for her mother, who had prayed over this union with the specific, earnest, undefended faith that Mama and Nena brought to everything she cared about. She cried for herself, for the woman who had ignored the thin explanations and the misplaced perfume and the occasional sharpness, who had taken each small warning and folded it away because she wanted the fairy tale to be real. And she cried for the baby. For the child who deserved to be wanted and who had just been described in his or her own father's comfortable voice as a mistake that wouldn't tie him down. Then the baby kicked. Foma pressed both hands flat against her stomach and breathed again. And the clarity came. She thought through every possible response. She mapped them out the way her father had taught her to think about difficult problems methodically, without panic, assessing each path for where it led. Running. She could vanish tonight. Call it off by phone in the morning. But running handed Emeka the narrative. He would become the jilted groom with the impossible pregnant bride. His version of events would be the first one told, the first one believed, the first one lodged in the family memory. Private confrontation, she could call him right now. But she knew him. In a private room, one-on-one, he would be controlled and surgical and patient. He would introduce doubt. He would say she had misheard, misunderstood, imagined. He would be kind and then wounded and then disappointed, and he would make the conversation about her capacity for trust rather than his capacity for betrayal. She had seen him perform his way out of smaller things. He would perform his way out of this too, given the space. No, he had been comfortable enough to be cruel in a lit room with an open window. He had counted on her softness. He had counted on her not looking, not listening, not arriving at the wrong moment with a gift in her hands. He had been wrong about all of it. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Ifeoma opened her phone and made a voice note. She recorded everything she had seen and heard in precise, sequential detail, not to release it, but to have it exist somewhere outside her own memory, somewhere she could not doubt or second-guess. Then she opened her audio files and found what she had not yet fully processed. The recording her phone had made accidentally, screen pressed to record in her jacket pocket while she stood at that window. Emeka's voice. Adaora's voice. Clear, complete, exactly as she had heard it. She listened to it twice. Then she put the phone down. Then she called Yuzo. Yuzo picked up on the second ring. No irritation, no sleepiness. Just, Ife. What is it? Foma spoke quietly and clearly for 4 minutes. She told Yuzo everything, not dramatically, not with tears, just the facts laid out in their proper order. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Tell me exactly what you need me to do, Yuzo said. Come tomorrow with a fully charged phone and a power bank. Sit in the 3rd row on the right. When I signal you, I need you recording. Everything done, Yuzo said. I'll be there. I'll be ready. They ended the call. Foma lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The compound was completely silent. The generator was off. Outside, Enugu was doing what it did in the deepest part of the night, contracting into itself, going still, waiting for morning. She did not sleep much. But somewhere in the small hours between the thinking and the lying still, she crossed over from grief into something harder and quieter. Not anger, anger was too hot and too consuming, and she needed all her steadiness for what was coming, something colder, more purposeful. The feeling of a woman who has decided to stop being acted upon and start acting. By the time the first morning light came through the curtains, and the compound began to wake with the sounds of aunties and caterers, and the low murmur of a family assembling itself for a celebration, Ifeoma had washed her face. She had pressed powder to her cheeks and lined her eyes and arranged her expression into something luminous. When Auntie Ngozi came to help her into the gown and stood behind her adjusting the veil, she told Ifeoma she was the most beautiful bride she had ever dressed in 40 years of attending weddings. Ifeoma smiled back at her with eyes that were warm and full and entirely composed. A lioness does not announce herself before she moves. Close up on Ifeoma's tear-streaked face in the dark, slow transition to her sitting upright on the bed, composing herself pattern interrupt cut to close-up of the phone recording waveform glowing in the dark room, then slow fade to morning light through the curtains. Chapter 3. The calm before the storm. The wedding hall that afternoon was everything Emeka had planned and nothing he deserved. 300 guests filled the decorated space in a tide of green and gold asoebi that seemed to shift and shimmer every time someone stood to greet an arriving relative or adjust a heel or lean across to whisper something into a neighbor's ear. The live Lagos band had set up on the raised platform to the left of the altar and was working through a set of Afrobeats and classic highlife that had the older women in the front rows swaying without self-consciousness, the particular unself-conscious sway of women who have danced at enough celebrations to know that dancing is not a performance but a response. Children threaded between chair rows until redirected firmly by uncles who were simultaneously greeting long-unseen relatives with the other hand. The flower arrangements, white lilies and golden Gerbera daisies in tall crystal vases, anchored every corner of the hall. The smell of rice and pepper soup and new lace fabric and women's perfume wove through the air into something almost visible, almost solid, the particular atmosphere of a Nigerian wedding at full force. Emeka stood at the altar and looked like everything he wanted people to see. He had composed himself beautifully. The white and gold agbada was magnificent. He received guests with warmth, chatted with his groomsmen with easy comfort, greeted the pastor with the confident familiarity of a man who has done nothing that would make a pastor uncomfortable. When he looked toward the entrance doors and saw the outer doors being pulled open, his expression was one of pure anticipation. He believed he had reached the finish line. He had no idea he was standing at the beginning of his own public destruction. Yuzo was already in the third row on the right. She had arrived early, taken her seat, ordered her face into the expression of a happy wedding guest, and sat with her power bank plugged in and her phone face down in her lap. She had heard everything that morning. She was perhaps the only person in the hall who fully understood the weight of what was about to happen, and she carried that knowledge with the steady, contained composure of a woman who loves her best friend and has decided to serve her completely. The music shifted. The outer doors opened fully. Ifeoma walked in. She was extraordinary. The gown caught the hall lights as she moved, and she seemed to carry her own illumination, a warm glow that moved with her down the aisle. The veil sat perfectly. The bouquet of white roses and golden ribbon trembled slightly, the only visible evidence that anything at all was happening beneath the surface of her composure. 300 people rose to their feet in a single unified motion, the way congregations rise for something that commands it. The sound that moved through the room was half gasp and half sigh, the involuntary, collective response to beauty arriving at the right moment. Mama Nnenna was weeping before Ifeoma had taken 10 steps. She pressed her handkerchief to her face and wept with the open, uncomplicated grief of a woman experiencing extreme happiness. Chief Akafor sat in the front row in his full regalia, his red cap, his ivory-handled staff, his agbada in the deep burgundy he reserved for the most important occasions, and watched his daughter approach the altar with an expression of such contained pride that 3 different people who observed him that day would later describe it as the most moving thing they had seen at the wedding. Before the wedding ended, before everything changed, Emeka watched her come and thought he had won. The ceremony moved through its liturgy. The pastor spoke about covenant and the sacred nature of the promises being made, about the institution of marriage as something built not in a single day but constructed daily through consistent choice. Vows were exchanged. Rings were produced and placed. The hall received each moment with the warm, appreciative attention of 300 people who had eaten well and were feeling favorably disposed toward love. Then came the time for personal words. Emeka stepped forward first. He spoke fluently about destiny and partnership, about recognizing Ifeoma across a room and knowing immediately, about the 3 years as a journey toward this moment, about his commitment to the family they would build together. He was smooth and warm and convincing. Several women in the second and third rows made sounds of appreciative endorsement. One aunt near the aisle dabbed her eyes. Then Ifeoma stepped forward and took the microphone. She stood still for 3 full seconds. The hall settled into complete silence, that particular attentive silence of 300 people who can feel without being told that something is shifting. Family, friends. Her voice was clear and unhurried. She smiled at the room, a genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. Thank you for traveling, some of you from very far, to be present for this day. It means everything to have you here. She paused. I want to say something from my heart. Emeka nodded, pleased, at the altar behind her. Last night, Ifeoma said, her voice still warm, still steady, I drove to Emeka's home to deliver a surprise wedding gift. She reached into her bouquet and lifted out the velvet box. She had carried it with her through the entire ceremony, tucked among the roses. She held it up briefly so the room could see it, then set it down on the altar table. I received a surprise of my own instead. The room shifted. The particular, instinctive shift of 300 people recognizing that the story they were in had just changed direction. I stood at his window, Ifeoma said, and I heard Emeka and my cousin Adaora planning in precise detail how they would collect my father's money after this wedding and relocate together to Abuja. How this baby, she touched her stomach with one hand, openly, without drama, was a mistake he never wanted. How I was too soft to ever discover the truth. The gasps moved through the hall in layers. The nearest rose first, then rippling outward to the back as the words reached each section in turn and detonated there. Ifeoma nodded once calmly, but I have his exact words. In his own voice. She reached behind her to where Yuzo had quietly positioned the sound system cable. She plugged the phone in with one hand, the movement practiced and exact. A brief crackle of static, and then Emeka's voice filled the hall, his own voice. Comfortable, unhurried, stripped of all the performance he deployed in public, just the private voice of a man who believed he was safe. Adaora's plan, laid out in her own words, his chuckle of agreement, the description of the job he had targeted, and then the 4 words that fell into the hall like dropped glass: this child was a mistake anyway. The hall did not erupt immediately. There was a half-second of absolute, suspended silence, the silence of 300 minds processing something simultaneously, and then it broke completely open. Women rose from their seats. Men turned to each other with faces that moved through shock to fury. Adaora stood up in the back, knocked over her chair, and moved toward the nearest exit. She walked directly into a formation of Ifeoma's aunties who had been quietly repositioning themselves since the moment Ifeoma began to speak. Nobody touched her. Nobody needed to. The wall of folded arms and level gazes was sufficient. Emeka moved toward Ifeoma. She stepped back from him 1 step, measured without hurry, and held his gaze. You betrayed me at the altar of lies, she said, quietly enough that the words were just for him. Today I return the favor with the truth. Then she turned. And she walked. The hall parted ahead of her. Yuzo stepped out of the 3rd row and fell into place at her side without a word. They walked down the aisle together, Ifeoma's head high, her spine absolutely straight, one hand on her belly, and out through the doors and into the afternoon light. Behind them, the hall continued to come apart at every seam. Slow digital zoom on Emeka's face as it drains of color, then close-up on Ifeoma's hand placing the velvet box on the altar table, then wide shot of the hall erupting in 3 stages. Front to back, then slow-motion close-up of Ifeoma and Yuzo walking out together. Shot from behind. the doors closing behind them. Chapter 4. The Altar of Truth. The minutes that followed inside that hall became the kind of story that gets told for years. Emeka's groomsmen stood in a helpless, uncertain formation at the altar, none of them sure whose side they were supposed to be on or what loyalty required in a situation for which there was no script. The pastor had stepped away from the altar and was conferring quietly with his co-officiant, both of them speaking with the careful, measured tones of men who understand they are in the middle of something that requires handling, not haste. Chief Akafor had risen from his front row seat. He was not shouting. He was not making proclamations. He simply stood very still, very upright, in his full regalia with an expression on his face that was, by multiple accounts, the most frightening thing in the room. Not because of anger, though the anger was there, but because of what lay beneath the anger, the precise, devastating comprehension of a man who understood exactly how his trust had been used as a tool. Emeka pushed through the stunned guests toward the aisle, calling Ifeoma's name. Ife, wait, listen to me, you have to let me explain, it is not what you are thinking. His voice followed her out through the doors. She did not slow her pace. Behind him, the guests responded as 300 Nigerians at a wedding respond when they have witnessed something extraordinary and unjust, loudly, collectively, and without diplomatic restraint. An Uncle Ifeoma had met only twice stood up on his seat and delivered a short speech in rapid Igbo that the rows around him received with sounds of passionate agreement. Two women in a soebai near the front had positioned themselves so that Adaora could not reach either of the side doors without passing through them. A groomsman quietly removed himself from the altar platform and went to stand by the main entrance, facing outward, making it clear which direction his sympathies lay. Adaora attempted 3 different strategies in succession. First, denial, delivered with tears. You misunderstood, the recording is edited. I can explain everything. Then a pivot to victimhood. Emeka manipulated me. I was confused. I am also a victim in this. Then a direct appeal to one of the older aunties, a woman Adaora had known since childhood, whose hand she reached for. The auntie looked at Adaora's hand on her arm for a long, measured moment and then, with great deliberateness, moved her arm away. The family did not need to say much. The audio had already said everything. Meanwhile, Yuzo's recording was uploading. She had filmed from the moment Ifeoma stepped forward and taken the microphone, the steady hands, the clear voice, the phone connecting to the sound system, the sound filling the hall, the eruption of the crowd. Within 20 minutes of Ifeoma walking out of the hall, the clip was moving through Enugu WhatsApp groups. Within an hour it had crossed into Anambra. By early evening it was in Lagos. By midnight it was in diaspora group chats in London and Houston and Johannesburg. By the following morning, journalists were making calls. The clip traveled because it contained everything that travels fastest: injustice witnessed and dignity maintained in the face of it. People forwarded it with captions that told the story in one line. Women recorded reaction videos. Church groups held discussions. A radio station in Lagos played the audio clip during a morning show and had to extend the segment by 40 minutes because the phone lines did not stop. Security eventually escorted Emeka out of the hall through the same door he had intended to use to walk into his new life. He went with the particular deflation of a man whose performance has finally, irrevocably, been seen through. He did not go quickly or without protest, but he went. Adaora was escorted out shortly after, through a side door, in the company of her own mother, who had been sitting 3 rows behind her, who had known nothing, who had come to celebrate her niece's wedding in her finest asoebai, and who was now walking out of the hall with her daughter's arm in her grip, and an expression of devastation and fury on her face that required no translation. The hall slowly restructured itself around the Akafor family. Chief Akafor said nothing publicly. He stood, and then he sat, and then he accepted the hands of well-meaning guests with the dignity of a man who knows that some things can only be processed in private. Mama Nnenna was surrounded by the women who love her, sitting with her, holding her hands, pressing water on her, speaking quietly. Gradually, the noise in the hall transformed from shock and outrage toward something warmer, the communal instinct of people who understand that a family has been hurt and who know, from long experience, how to close around their own. The caterers, to their considerable credit, continued to serve food. This was perhaps the most Nigerian thing that happened that afternoon. Ifeoma was in the bridal preparation room at the back of the hall, sitting in a cushioned chair with her heels removed and her feet flat on the cool tile floor. The veil had come off. The bouquet sat on the dressing table. Yuzo was beside her. Three of her closest cousins, none of them from Adaora's branch of the family, stood at the door with the quiet, steady solidarity of people who have decided they are not moving. Ifeoma ate a small piece of the wedding cake that someone had thought to bring. She drank 2 glasses of water. She sat with her hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby move in the slow, rolling way of a child who is comfortable, and she breathed all the way down. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, the full, deep breath of someone who has done an extremely difficult thing and is still standing. She did not feel victorious. She did not feel broken either. She felt clean. Like something that had been sitting on her chest since she stood at that window had finally been lifted away, and she could expand back into her full shape, the shape that was entirely her own and had never had anything to do with Emeka. "Are you okay?" Yuzo asked quietly, the way Yuzo always asked the real questions. Ifeoma sat with it. "I will be," she said. "I think I already am, a little." Yuzo put her arm around her and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. That night Ifeoma went home with her mother. Mama and Nena warmed soup. They sat together in the kitchen in the particular quiet of women who have been through something together and do not yet need to discuss it. Then Ifeoma went to bed, and she slept genuinely, deeply. The sleep of a body and a mind that have spent everything they had and found solid ground on the other side. She slept better than she had in months. Wide shot of the hall in controlled chaos, then cut to close-up of Chief Okafor's steady, devastated face, then close-up of Ifeoma in the bridal room, shoes off, hand on belly, face completely at peace, then slow fade to black. Chapter 5. From broken bride to bold mother. The weeks that followed were not simple. Healing is rarely simple, and Ifeoma had never been a woman who performed things for appearances. There were days in the first weeks when she sat in her childhood bedroom and felt the full weight of what she was carrying, not the pregnancy, though that was real and present and increasingly physical, but the grief. The specific, layered grief of a woman who has discovered that 3 years of her life were constructed on deliberate deception. That the man she chose with care and patience had been choosing something else entirely, from the beginning, while wearing the face of sincerity. That the cousin she had grown up alongside, whose laugh she could identify from across a compound, had sat at her family's table and eaten her mother's cooking while participating in the plan to destroy her. She allowed herself those days. She sat with the grief, and she moved through it honestly, at her own pace, without rushing toward recovery or performing an okayness she did not fully feel. This was not weakness. It was the opposite of weakness, the willingness to let difficult things be difficult, and to trust that they would not remain so indefinitely. Mama Nena was her anchor. She did not crowd her daughter with words or advice or the particular maternal anxiety of wanting to solve what cannot be solved quickly. She simply remained present, warm, steady, feeding her, sitting with her, maintaining the rhythm of the household around her. It was, Ifeoma would later say, the most loving thing she had ever witnessed. Chief Okafor moved differently. He channeled everything into action, the way he always had when confronted with threats to his family. He revoked the business promise to Emeka through a brief, formal, hand-delivered letter, and then spent 3 days with a lawyer confirming that no financial transfers had been made and that no legal agreements had been signed that could be exploited. When he was satisfied that the family's interests were fully protected, he folded his hands, settled back into his chair, and waited for his grandchild with the patience of a man who has learned that the most important things cannot be hurried. Emeka attempted contact twice in the weeks that followed. Both times his messages went unread. The third time Ifeoma opened her phone, found the notification, and blocked him on every platform with the calm efficiency of someone performing a necessary administrative task. She felt nothing in particular when she did it. No satisfaction, no grief, no residual tenderness. Just the quiet tidiness of closing a door that was already permanently shut. Adaora did not attempt contact. She had returned to her mother's house in another part of the state and was, by all available information, keeping an extremely low profile. The family had handled the situation in the way Igbo families handle their most painful internal matters quietly, privately, with closed doors and direct conversations that outsiders were not invited to observe. Ifeoma was not required to participate in any of it. Her only task was to protect herself and her child, and this she did with deliberate focus. 6 months after the wedding that never became a marriage, Ifeoma gave birth. She went into labor on a Tuesday morning, quietly at first, and then with the gathering force of something that had been building for a long time and was done waiting. She delivered at a private hospital near the GRA, the same hospital where she herself had been born at 4:17 in the morning, with Mama Nena holding her right hand and Yuzo holding her left, both of them breathing with her through the hardest parts with the wordless, physical solidarity of women who love each other. Chief Akafor sat alone in the waiting room downstairs. His chief's cap was in his hands. He was not reading his phone. He was not packing. He was sitting very still and doing what his own mother had taught him to do in moments where control was entirely outside his reach. He was praying. The old Igbo prayers, the ones that do not translate cleanly into English, the ones that are more feeling than language. He prayed them quietly under his breath while the hospital went about its middle-of-the-night business around him. At 4:17, a cry cut through the corridor. High, furious, brand new, a boy. They named him Chukwudi Akafor. God exists. Not because it was fashionable, not because it was the first name that came to mind, but because it was precisely and completely true. God had existed in the kick in the car that night that had steadied her, in the recording that had been made by accident, in the clarity that had arrived at 3 in the morning when she needed it most. God had existed, and this child was the evidence. Chukwudi entered the world with enormous dark eyes that seemed to be already taking inventory of everything around them, his grandfather's deeply stubborn chin, and an expression of intense, focused personal outrage that made the midwife laugh out loud and then apologize and then laugh again. Chief Akafor was brought up from the waiting room, and he held his grandson for 23 minutes without speaking. His shoulders moved once. His jaw tightened once. Then he cleared his throat, squared his shoulders, looked down at the child in his arms, and announced, with the quiet authority of a man who has made a decision, this boy will have the best of everything I can provide. Starting now. Mama Nena, characteristically, had already begun coordinating the post-birth cooking arrangements by phone from the ward corridor. Ifeoma recovered steadily. She was attentive and careful and realistic, not rushing herself, but not lingering in limitation either. She learned the particular rhythms of new motherhood, the night feeds and the extraordinary exhaustion and the moments of fierce, overwhelming love that arrived without warning and left her slightly breathless. She learned her son his patterns, his preferences, the specific pitch of his different cries, the way his whole face changed when he heard his grandmother's voice. She learned how to carry him and work and rest and think, all at the same time in the way that mothers learn. She returned to teaching 4 months postpartum, and it was, she would say later, one of the most healing things she did. The nursery school classroom was exactly as she had left it. Loud, colorful, crayon-scented, full of small people discovering the world with tremendous enthusiasm and no sense of proportion. They received her back without comment or complexity, the way children receive the people they love, simply glad she was there, ready to tell her everything they had learned in her absence. She found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the classroom still filled her in exactly the same way it always had, that the joy was intact, that whoever she was, the essential things had not been damaged. The baby clothes business began as something she had not planned. She had been sewing small garments for Chukwudi from the beginning, not because she couldn't buy them, but because she wanted to. because she had always loved fabric and the satisfaction of making things with her hands. The pieces she made were simple but beautiful: soft cotton and Igbo pattern prints, tiny Yoruba trims, embroidered details small enough to examine closely but visible enough to admire from across a room. Friends noticed. Then friends of friends noticed. Then a woman at church held up Chukwudi's outing outfit during the peace offering and asked, in front of 50 people, where it had come from. When 3 separate women asked in the same week whether she could make pieces for their own bobbies, she said yes. Then 10 more. Then she opened an Instagram page on a Thursday night after Chukwudi's 9 o'clock feed while the house was quiet and she was still wearing her nursing clothes. And by Sunday, she had 62 inquiries and 40 confirmed orders. She named the business NWA Chukwu God's Child because it was his business as much as hers. Within a year, it had outgrown what she could manage with her own 2 hands. She hired 3 women from the neighborhood. Mama Yudo, who had been unemployed since the garment factory near the market closed; Chidinma, who was 19 and learning to sew and deeply serious about it; and Patience, whose speed with a machine was something that had to be witnessed to be believed. Together they built the operation, sourcing fabric directly from the Aba textile market, establishing a waiting list, maintaining a consistency of quality that the business became known for. The journalists came because of the WhatsApp video, which never fully stopped circulating. Reporters from Lagos magazines and Abuja newspapers and one international platform that covered African women entrepreneurs found Ifeoma through the clip and wanted the full story. She gave carefully selected interviews to a few of them. She spoke without bitterness and without performance. She did not position herself as a victim. She spoke about Chukwudi, about NWA Chukwu, about what she had learned about herself in the process of going through something she would never have chosen. When they betray you at the altar, she told one journalist, return with the truth. Not for destruction's sake. Not because revenge is sweet, it isn't, not really. With the truth, because truth is the only foundation on which you can build something real afterward. Everything else is mud. She was asked in a different interview whether she regretted going ahead with the ceremony rather than calling it off the night she found out. She thought about it honestly. No, she said finally, because if I had called it off in the night, the story would have been his to tell in the morning. Women have had their stories told for them for too long. I needed to tell mine in public, in front of the people who needed to hear it so it could never be revised. She was asked if she would trust a man again. She looked at Chukwudi, who was sitting on the office floor at her feet, engaged in a very serious project involving 2 wooden blocks and a rolled-up magazine. He looked up at her at exactly that moment as though he had heard the question and wanted to observe her answer. I trust myself now, she said. Completely, for the first time. That is the beginning of everything. The speaking invitations began arriving after the second interview. Women's fellowships, university campuses, a church conference. A foundation that worked with single mothers in low-income communities across Enugu State. She accepted what she could, declined what she couldn't, and at every engagement she spoke without notes, without a prepared speech, with only the truth of her own experience laid out plainly for whoever needed to hear it. Women came to find her afterward. Always. Women with their own versions of the same story, different names, different cities, different specific betrayals, who had swallowed their truths in silence because they were afraid of what speaking would cost them. Women who had been told that their pain was private, that their dignity was negotiable, that enduring was strength and speaking was weakness. She told them all the same thing: your dignity was never his to take. You have been carrying it all along. Begin from that. Emeka, as far as anyone knew, had not returned to Enugu. His name came up occasionally in the peripheral conversations of people who had mutual acquaintances, surfacing briefly and then disappearing again, the way the names of people who have made themselves irrelevant tend to disappear. He had not become a scandal so much as an absence, a shape that had been removed from a picture, leaving the picture completely intact. Adaora remained the more complicated pain. Because betrayal by someone you share blood with does not process the way other betrayals do, it lives in a different chamber of the heart, and it takes longer to quiet. Ifeoma did not pretend otherwise. She did not perform forgiveness she hadn't arrived at, and she did not perform hardness she didn't feel either. She carried the wound with honesty, and gradually, month by month, it changed its nature from a raw thing to a healed thing, visible in the way scar tissue is visible but no longer demanding constant attention. Today, Chukwudi Okafor is the most opinionated, most energetic, most thoroughly adored small person in Enugu according to his grandfather, who reports this information with unconcealed satisfaction every opportunity he gets. The business has a waiting list that stretches several months forward. The nursery school classroom has new crayon drawings on the walls, families of every configuration, drawn with the confident, unapologetic specificity of children who have not yet been taught that there is only one right shape for a family. And Ifeoma. She rises every morning in a house that she has filled with her own choices. She teaches children who love her. She builds a business that is entirely hers. She raises a son who looks at her with his grandfather's eyes and his own completely particular soul. She speaks truth in rooms full of women who needed someone to go first. She is, by every measure that matters, free. The end, when they betray you at the altar of lies, return with the truth, not for revenge for yourself, because the truth clears the ground, and on clear ground a woman like you can build anything. Ifeoma Okafor outro, call to action. Family, if this story moved something in you, if it gave you strength, if it made you think of a woman in your life who needed to hear exactly this, please like this video right now and share it immediately. Every share is this story reaching another woman who may be sitting somewhere tonight needing to be reminded that she is not alone and that her dignity is not negotiable. Subscribe to Stories That Heal and hit the notification bell, because we have stories coming that you do not want to miss. And drop a comment below. Which moment in Ifeoma's story hit you the hardest? Was it the window, the microphone, the walk down the aisle, the baby's kick in the dark car? Tell me. I read every single comment, everyone. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, tell your truth. Your story is not over. It is only just beginning.